Ivan Kłyszcz is an analyst and researcher specializing in core issues of international security, notably great power competition, the grand strategy of major powers, and Russian foreign policy. In recent years, his research has focused on Moscow's engagements with the countries of the so-called Global South, with particular focus on Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. His research has been extensively cited in international media, including Al-Jazeera, BBC, Deutsche Welle, France 24, and others, and it has attracted interests from diplomats, governments, and major NGOs. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like, subscribe, and definitely comment on the videos to help them perform better in YouTube's algorithm. It really does help people to discover the fantastic speakers who give up their time to help inform us. Please also do check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. Ivan, I'm delighted to welcome you.
Thank you for having me.
And as you reminded me earlier, I should say you are a colleague of James Scher at the same institute. And of course, if people haven't sort of seen that previous interview, I very much recommend they check it out. And of course, we're going to put links to your various publications and the institute you're associated with. We're going to put all the details into the description of the video so that people can sort of follow up. But let's get started. We're going to talk, obviously, in the latter part of the interview about Global South, BRICS, and so on, and Russia's global strategy towards other regions of the world who perhaps are less engaged on the Ukrainian side in the conflict. But let's start with an area which I think is also fascinating, a bit close to home, and that is Chechnya, because, of course, Chechnya is ruled by, I'm not even sure you could call him a puppet of Putin's, but certainly he's someone very much aligned to Putin's regime. And Chechnya is speculated to be one of those points where potentially Putin's foreign policy empire could start to unravel. Let's start with your understanding of that. Is Chechnya strong, or is it potentially an Achilles heel for the Putin regime?
Yes, certainly. Chechnya is a sensitive spot for the Kremlin. It's important to keep in mind that Russia has fought two wars and spent so many lives and so many resources in trying to capture this territory that, from their point of view, always belonged to Russia. And although, of course, we can talk about the narratives and the representations. But of course, from the point of view of the Kremlin, this is a place where Russian blood was spilled in large amounts, and that they fought tooth and nail to gain. So certainly, and they're aware, of course, as well that Chechnya has been at the focus of attention of Washington, of all Western capitals, as well as capitals and societies across the Middle East, which in their minds, of course, connects to Islamic radicalism threat, though, of course, there's also nuances there with a lot of it being conjured and exaggerated, a lot of it being real as well. So there's space kind of to also examine that. So definitely Chechnya and its future is actually quite central because the whole building of this is something we can delve in more, but for now let me just state it like this. The whole building of post-Soviet Russia is built on the capture of Chechnya and the constitutional black hole that the capture of Chechnya created for Russian constitutional order. There's kind of limits to that, but I believe that the centrality of Chechnya is actually quite sometimes understated.
And of course, the strength of Putin as an individual, he appeared, no one knew who he was. He's a pretty grey man as well, a fairly grey personality, and he's been built up into perhaps far more than he was at that start. But the second war in Chechnya was a critical part, wasn't it, in building the sort of mystique and image of Putin and his power.
Definitely, it has to do with it has to do with many actually narratives and representations of Putin and of Russia and of the Kremlin. It has to do with, like you mentioned, Putin as a warlord, as commander in chief, as a warrior that fights for Russia and for justice, which is a constant theme across all of the many Putin's wars that we have witnessed. It has to do also with especially nowadays, especially in more recent years, it has to do with the defense, of course, in this old narratives and all the propaganda, the defense of traditional values, which in the case of Chechnya has to do with the defense of traditional Islam against the supposed modernist interpretations of Islam. And it has to do with preserving the unity of the Russian Federation, with all these ideas that if Chechnya becomes independent, then others will follow. And that has also the background of maintaining gathering and maintaining the Russian lands. And of course, Putin has identified quite strongly with that, as his behavior has revealed. So definitely, when it comes to the discourses around the Kremlin, Chechnya is also very central.
And on a practical level, because we know that Putin's vertical system very much is based on a kind of hierarchy, but it's a hierarchy of power. So you recognize that the guy above you has the power to potentially destroy you in a variety of different ways. And to some extent, Kadyrov, who one would suspect has no limits, let's say, on the brutality in which he can inflict on those who cross his path, to an extent, that's a very powerful tool, isn't it, for Putin to wield, to threaten against oligarchs, to threaten against oppositionists, to threaten against anybody who may step out of line. And of course, we saw the potential role of Chechen assassins in the murder of Boris Nemtsov, one of his main perceived rivals, and one of the few people who I think, many in Russia could imagine as an alternative leader for the country. The fact he was killed literally, yards away from the Kremlin makes it extremely unlikely that didn't have official approval in some way.
Yes, certainly. There is this reputation of Chechen assassins of Chechnya, indeed, as this. It has to do with the fact that it's a black hole when it comes to constitutional order and norms. So it is this resource for the Kremlin to deploy, either at least to threaten, if not to outright assassinate.
And we'll move on from this theme in a minute, but I think obviously rumors come up extremely frequently, and it's given rise to a million different memes on Twitter as well. But this is the supposed fragility of Kadyrov. It seems likely that he is more ill than Putin. It seems likely he will shuffle off the stage sooner than Putin. We don't know when and in what capacity. Has he done enough to set up a sort of succession process for his son, I believe? Or is this a point of extreme instability and risk?
Yes, I want to comment kind of about the story more broadly, because I think it's incredibly challenging. I, of course, defer to Novaya Gazeta Europe and the reporting on Chechnya. I have nothing but the utmost respect, but it is a challenging story because, on the one hand, it is clear that Kadyrov is not who he used to be. I think that's kind of plainly visible. But I think the sources for this type of to say this with entire confidence, it's challenging. It's simply challenging. So I don't dismiss this possibility. But putting that aside, I think part of the reason why it's fascinating and actually important to reflect about this potential of succession and who might rule Chechnya, it's a reflection of how centralized power is in Chechnya. If power is centralized in Russia, and Chechnya is perhaps even more extreme, and it has to do, of course, with the fact that it's a smaller society. It's 1,300,000 individuals, and it's power centralized with no checks and balances. It's all around one man and his patronage network, built a lot of it around his own family members. So, in that sense, yes, it is the question. Like, there's nothing other than him in that system. So who would step up in such a case? And of course, his children are still rather young. But the precedent is that indeed power would go from within his family. Ramzan Kadyrov was granted power by the Kremlin from his because of his father, because of Ahmad Kadyrov, who was the warlord who switched sides in the Second Chechen War in benefit of the Kremlin, and thus facilitating the capture of Chechnya by Russian forces. So in that sense, this precedent, I think, is very important. So, of course, it is natural to look at his family. But, of course, he also has cousins. He also has a broader family. So I think the Kremlin would also be quite, it's also sometimes quite conservative when it comes to dealing with succession issues and those areas that they consider to be more fragile and unstable, quote unquote. And I think Chechnya is one of those that they don't want to disturb too much the, let's say, the precedent or the established procedure. So if they try to, so I'm not saying that it's impossible that they would try to bring in someone from outside of the family structure of Kadyrov, or someone who would come out of nowhere, that is not currently in the public spotlight as much as Kadyrov and his close associates. But it could be an element of overreach as well. They would try to impose too much, try to impose this harmonization agenda that they have at the federal level too strongly, and maybe that might be a misstep if they want to maintain the system that, the way it's been all these years.
Well, let's transition from Chechnya as a topic through to Ukraine, and there's an interesting connecting point, isn't there? Because the Second Chechen War and Russia's sort of victory over the country shows very clearly the mechanic of Russian imperialism at work, doesn't it? You have many people fighting Russian imperialism. You have Dzhokhar Dudayev, who makes incredibly prescient predictions about what's going to happen. He says, Chechnya will fall, but the point at which Russia attacks Ukraine, and he talked about that being inevitable, that's the point at which the Russian Empire will finally break. And I think he used the terms, when the Ukrainian sun rises, the Russian imperial sun will set. So that there's that extraordinary sort of connection there. But we also see the mechanic of imperialism at work, in that Russia's able to conquer the territory, as it were, or co-opt the territory of Chechnya, and then turn people there into useful soldiers, into assets that it can throw to try and extend its conquest to the next territory, which in this case is Ukraine. So do you see this as an important factor, or an important realization, and something that actually is not new, part of a Russian imperial process that has a deep heritage?
Yes, certainly. Dudayev was very prescient and his interviews on this topic are quite insightful. And the context of some of those interviews is quite important. They're filmed just as in the middle of the first Chechen War that went from 1994 to 1996. One very famous interview happened in 1995. So definitely, it's, and Dudayev as a member of the kind of a part of the Soviet military, Air Force. I don't remember his rank exactly, but in the Air Force, he knew kind of the culture of the Russian military and how it preserves a certain way of thinking about the international relations, about imperial powers, and about what are Russia's sources of strength, which there's entrenched idea in ruling circles in Russia and across large sections of Russian society that Russia's claim to be a great power actually comes from its military and from its military strength. It doesn't come from its technology or its appeal internationally. It comes from the military, and that's something that as time has gone on and kind of the Soviet era technology accomplishments in sciences, think of Sputnik, they fade they fade in memory, and military power is what remains. So he was very present. So I think that that's something that he understood quite well, and that's something that I think is more has become only more relevant as time has gone by.
And of course, Putin seems to be terrified more than anything of what he calls color revolutions. And any organic politics is seen as political technology. So Maidan, the revolution of dignity, that cannot be an organic process. It has to be the CIA. It has to be, a plot. And this paranoia seems to seep into everything. Now, of course, we have Georgia in turmoil and ferment. Is Putin likely to see this as another nefarious plot by ultimately the US? Because, of course, he also sees Europe as puppets of US foreign policy.
Yes, definitely. It's definitely going to be in that way, because this is also a very entrenched way of thinking, which is not even post-Soviet. It is Soviet KGB type thinking. It is that type of thinking like you mentioned, that people don't have agency. They only are cogs in a broader economic structure, as it was believed back in the Soviet era, or today part of a it's not as spelled out in the case of today's Russia, but there is this idea. There is a similar idea that maybe not that people are not necessarily cogs in an economic machine, but that people are reflections of their cultures and civilizations. And this is the civilizational thinking in the Kremlin today that also dehumanizes and withdraws the possibility of agency from individuals. I would even call it reactionary, because it presumes that because it takes back human rights, and it takes back the centrality of human value, intrinsic human value, and places that of these broader notions of culture and civilization as that what gives value. So that's kind of when it comes to the ideas. When it comes to the case of Georgia, I definitely expect that they will deploy similar narratives when it comes to the protest, when it comes to the law. We already have some indications that they're going that way, because they're some, let's say, Kremlin-minded outlets and individuals, kind of accounts on social media. They already are pointing fingers at so-called international NGOs, as if this was a concoction that came from abroad, which again is a leitmotif in this paranoid, nihilistic worldview that the Kremlin has embraced.
And what are the risks there? Because, of course, if Putin wasn't mired in Ukraine, with his sort of forces and armor essentially taken up there with that fight, would Georgia be in serious risk? Could it even be in serious risk despite of Ukraine? Because we saw Russia's intervention in Crimea. Russia's already made an intervention into Georgia in 2008 and actually controls, through its proxies, around 20% of that territory, which is very familiar given that around 20% is what Russia controls of Ukraine at this point in time. What are the risks of intervention, and what are the limiting factors that mean perhaps intervention could not take place at this time?
The key limiting factor, of course, is the way Russia's war against Ukraine is going. We can discuss whether it's who is winning, who is losing, but it's clear that all the attentions and resources of the Kremlin are on Ukraine. That said, I think the things are still a bit in the air about how Russia might act when it comes to Georgia. I think right now they're on their back foot. The Kremlin is on their back foot when it comes to many theaters. They didn't really act all that much when it came to Armenia, although some say that the wars that have happened in Armenia are more a punishment, are enabled by Russia to punish the democratic revolution that happened there in 2018. So in that sense, I don't know how would Russia act where a transition in power happened now through the protests. let's say, a revolution simply, the punishment might not be straight away. It might come later, especially as its resources become less tied up in Ukraine, or it might not come at all, of course, where Russia to suffer a strong defeat in Ukraine.
And of course,
So,
the protesters, I mean, the protesters are at this point not calling for the government to fall. They're calling for the process that is blocking EU integration, with the government clearly kind of going slow on that or trying to put barriers. They're simply at this point trying to move, I would say, a single issue forward. But of course, as we saw in Ukraine, if the equivalent to the Berkut, or if there's a slaughter of some sort, and we're starting to see extremely brutal treatment, then the demands on the side of the protesters could certainly escalate.
Yes, I think we're on the brink of that process indeed, where there is that sense that the protests are not being listened to, that this what so-called Russian law is proceeding. So as long as the government does not listen to the protests and try to actually step back when it comes to this law initiative, I only fear that there will be a escalation on the part of the government, precisely because of its intransigence. So I believe that we might see an escalation in that sense of pressure and growing demands for change in the government. Perhaps there will be a solution that prevents this, but right now, well, that will require courage, and I don't know who will step up to prevent such a scenario.
And of course, the situation is slightly different, isn't it? Because yes, there were oligarchs who were directly tools of the Kremlin in Ukraine, but there were many oligarchs, and oligarchs were competing against each other. It seems that in Georgia, it's a slightly different situation. You've got one mega oligarch who owns a significant chunk of the economy. I mean, I've heard various figures that almost made me fall off my chair. I mean, huge amounts of money and resources. And this individual, clearly, extremely connected, but you don't have that competing environment of oligarchs, which makes it a more perhaps in some ways unstable situation for the Kremlin. Stable when you're controlling it, unstable if you start to lose control of that scenario.
Yeah, and without competing centers of power, without the thing is, repression doesn't work generally, but indeed, but when you combine it with a closed political system, when you combine it with institutions that are not responsive to demands, then the temptation will be to try to suffocate initiative that comes from the bottom up. So let's see.
So let's move on to we're gonna tackle the sort of global South and BRICS in a minute, but before we do that, there does seem to be a significant escalation in so-called grey zone warfare by Russia. We've got the Baltic Jammer, or that's been going for a long time. It's just the media have just started to sort of pay attention to it. But we see allegedly, potential attacks on Western installations, factories, etc. It's still quite murky about the sort of what's going on there. And we see random acts of violence against, say, Ukrainian servicemen, which may just be the result of Russian propaganda rather than any kind of intelligence networks and so on. But it does seem that Russia is starting to escalate attacks in the so-called grey zone. Will Russia, do you think, continue to do this until they are met with a hard response? And where could this go?
Yes, it is an evolving threat. It is an evolving situation. I think it's evolving for Russia as well. We've seen the trend that I've detected, I think is not spoken about enough, is the increased number of well, it's the fact that Russia's intelligence agencies in Europe are relying more and more on intermediaries. They often hire individuals from the kind of criminal world to carry out attacks against dissidents abroad, attacks against Ukrainians abroad, allegedly against installations that are meant to support, kind of involved in the support of Ukraine. systems like hiring people through Telegram to do propaganda, hiring them to paste a poster on the walls in the streets, things like that. It's a very it's almost it's hard to describe, but it's this type of intermediary kind of work that is kind of low stakes, seemingly, when it comes to some of these tasks that they hire individuals to do. But then it has the potential to escalate and to actually be more bold and aggressive. So I think it becomes less clearly a matter of kind of intelligence and counterintelligence, and more a matter of even more so a matter of law enforcement. So I think this is a very important and kind of concerning trend, that Russia will try to work even more closely with the criminal world across Europe and internationally to pursue operational, almost tactical objectives in intelligence in Europe.
And the US, Europe have only just started to respond with a little bit of force and pushback against Russia in Ukraine, and that's in the conventional warfare sense. We're starting to see ATACMS certainly being deployed against targets in Crimea far more extensively. We're not quite sure yet, but it seems that electricity substations along logistics and rail routes are being hit inside Russia itself. It's not clear yet whether those are ATACMS, but that would be a very interesting development there. So we're developing a hardening response to Russia, I would say, on the conventional war. But is it far more difficult for Western governments and indeed Western media and the Western public to really understand the threat from grey zone and formulate a response to it?
It is harder because it is more diffused. It's the gray zone, after all. It is area of it might not be the wilderness of mirrors, to use the figure of speech when it comes to intelligence and espionage. It is more forceful. It does involve manipulating people, even carrying out acts of aggression against individuals. But yeah, it is harder to explain. I think recent cases have really woken people up to this threat. Although, of course, in Central and Eastern Europe, we've been quite aware of it. I'm based in Estonia, and here there was a case of the Bronze Soldier riots or Bronze Soldier crisis, which initially was thought to be a case of, let's say, radicalism, kind of a case of radicalism and kind of crime and law enforcement. But as time has gone on and evidence has mounted, there is strong evidence and a strong case to be made that this was a hybrid attack that combined precisely elements of the criminal underworld, cyber attacks that were carried out also by proxy, and diplomatic pressure, kind of conventional ways of exerting pressure on a country below the threshold of war. So I think Estonia has a very important experience there, all the way back in 2007, and this has applied also more broadly to Central and Eastern Europe, and I think Western Europe and the West more broadly is kind of beginning to wake up to the realization that this is also happening in their societies.
And one level beyond the grey zone, of course, is insurgency. And we have seen certainly, the resurgence of the Taliban, which eventually was able to kick the US out of Afghanistan. The role of Russia within that and the alliance between Russia and the Taliban is not talked about perhaps as nearly as much as it should be. But you also see Russian involvement, certainly in resource extraction across the sub-Saharan, the Sahel region. There have been numerous coups in that region. Now, we can't say definitively whether Russia was behind those or the role it might have played within them, but it is certainly utilizing the political instability there to increase its presence and to inject, Wagner security forces to support autocrats, and of course, its money-making schemes there around rare earth metals, gems, gold, etc. Is this another area, let's say, in between, hot warfare and the grey zone, which we have not paid nearly enough attention to?
I think there has been some attention to this Russian involvement internationally, especially in these areas that there's some crisis or sudden transition, coup d'etat, civil war, that Russia actually seeks to gain influence by becoming involved in different ways, sometimes by being directly involved, having boots on the ground through Wagner or now Africa Corps, so-called, or African Legion. But from that to just traditional diplomacy of trying to coalesce with some partners on the ground and position Russia as a potential mediator and thus increase Moscow's influence in the region. This is in a way an integral component of Russia's claims to great power. And it actually has a heritage all the way from the Gorbachev era, because the Kremlin, the Soviet Union at that time, was changing its approach to the competition with the West, no longer seeking to directly compete with the capitalist bloc, and more seeking to coalesce with the United States in a way to become the US indispensable partner, try to actually separate Europe from the US and become, so Moscow and Washington would kind of solve the world's problems. So Russia to this day, it's a weird kind of continuity that Russia to this day wants to position itself as a mediator and indispensable partner across the world's conflicts, to become unavoidable for Washington to engage with Moscow, because in turn that would help the Kremlin to its real objective, which is to make its system of government legitimate. Today, no form of government in the world is legitimate other than democracy, and democracy understood in quite concrete terms of elections, of liberties, individual freedoms, and rights. And of course, Russia would like its idea of so-called democracy to be legitimated. So far.
And that's a rabbit hole, isn't it? Discussing Russian democracy as a concept, because clearly, as a hybrid autocracy or hybrid information autocracy, it's rapidly, I would say, transitioned away from that into a clear autocracy. And in fact, the debate now is as to whether it's a classic autocracy or fascistic. And that's a recent video we just put up on the channel. And given that, from our perspective, we look at it and we see Russia as I would say, a meddling imperial power driven by, I would even label it a parasitic autocracy. Not a particularly, positive label there, but it has been able to position itself as the champion of anti-colonialism in parts of the global south. And again, we have to say it's nuanced there, because there are countries that don't buy into that. But it has been able to position itself as a sort of anti-America, anti-colonial, which of course, to my mind, is extraordinary, given that if you're closer to it, you could describe Russia as a prisoner of nations, prisoner of nationalities. It's a classic European imperial structure, albeit it's a land-based one, and some of the mechanics are a little bit different, I would say, going back sort of centuries and centuries, as opposed to the classic sort of 18th, 19th century model of imperialism. How does Russia position itself in regions like the global south to, I would say, whitewash what to us is a fairly sort of dark system and intent?
Yes, certainly. It is quite striking that Russia is embracing this anti-colonial narrative, being itself an empire, pretty much, and waging a rather colonial war against Ukraine, trying to subjugate that nation. But this is a narrative that they have been articulating for some time. The idea is that the way I understand the narrative that they articulate, and it indeed is connected to their system of government, and to their claims that their system of government is, again, using quotation marks, democratic. I agree with you that it's more a parasitarian autocracy and with elements of fascism as well. The way they're trying to sell this and the way they articulate it is by saying that in the unipolar world after the end of the Cold War, the West has been attempting to impose its values and ideas onto other, what they call civilizations and other cultures. So in a way, it's Russia's because there are also no colonists today. So what sense does it make to speak about anti-colonialism? We can talk about neo-colonialism, but that's a completely other discussion. So rather, what Russia's attempting to do is to portray a universal conception of human rights with some sort of imposition from the West, some sort of colonial meddling. And they lace this with this narrative about civilizations, claiming that there's a cohesive Latin American or African civilization that the West is trying to meddle with by imposing its values. So Russia positions itself like a champion of traditional values worldwide, and of this supposed diversity of civilizations. But in reality, it's all a way to convince like-minded authoritarian governments to coalesce with Russia by saying, your idea of your system of government, they're trying to give a narrative that is it is a narrative that they're trying to actually give to other countries, so that they can articulate their opposition to the West and their opposition to attempts at changing their form of government, their opposition to democracy, to articulate it in some way that is roughly persuasive. And unfortunately, this narrative has some constituents around the world, including in the West.
And is it also attractive to, I would say, quasi-autocrats, or those who aspire to or admire autocratic qualities? This might upset some people, but Donald Trump clearly has a certain amount of admiration for dictators. But you have Orban, Fico. In India, you have Modi, who, of course, it's one of the world's largest democracies, but there are tendencies there of a quasi-autocrat to try to coerce and dilute institutions to be able to extend their power in terms of longevity and reach. It does seem that Putin is able to operate in not just the world of autocrats, but the quasi-autocrats as well.
Yeah, definitely. And this applies across the global south and across the world, really.
And really the last area, and this is, I think, probably one of the more challenging ones, what we've seen in the Middle East has very much, it diverted attention away from Ukraine. It was one of the factors that led to the months-long, I would say, sort of gap in sort of funding and supplying Ukraine, which has been so damaging. Now it's starting to be reversed, but its losses in manpower and momentum were significant over the 6 to 8 months where ammunition started to run out. In this sense, there's been a lot talked about the so-called axis of authoritarians. That is Iran, Hamas, Russia, and other proxies as well. How far do you think this is real, or how far is this an alliance of sort of convenience? What's their commonality, and is this axis, if it does exist, a threat to the international rules-based order that the US has sought to create since World War II?
Yes, this is indeed kind of a question about the almost future of international security, and I think it is evolving. It's an evolving situation, which is it's evolving for all the actors concerned. I think when it comes, for instance, the relationship between Iran and Russia, or Russia and North Korea, they never saw each other, or they haven't seen each other as allies in a long time. For instance, North Korea and Moscow, since the Cold War, really. But now it's clear that Russia is reaching out to new partners that share a certain opposition to the international order, that want to revise it, as I mentioned earlier, to make it a world safe for their own autocratic forms of government. And I think that is the coalescing element for them, because otherwise they don't really trust each other. And I think to talk about trust among dictators is it's absurd. In that sense, there cannot be truly allies all the way. I think, but that doesn't mean that they won't coalesce. I think the parallel between, for instance, fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, it's hard to say that they actually trusted each other. Of course, they shared many elements in their worldview and in their attitude towards just humanity in general, and never mind international politics. So that's an example of how different autocratic governments that don't necessarily share everything in common might coalesce and actually end up being allies in the broader confrontation. I think, analogies with the Second World War are always very loaded, so I tried carefully. But just to retain one thing is that, yes, these countries might seem quite different, and their interests and their perspectives can be quite different, but it's important to take seriously the fact that they are coalescing and working together.
United by a common enemy, perhaps that's and lastly, the China-Russia axis there, that is even more difficult, isn't it, to really dig into, because it's clear that China has been providing some resources, it has been providing certain military components and some equipment, but not necessarily, artillery shells, not necessarily heavy equipment. And for all of the benefits it's received for a low cost of Russian hydrocarbons and so on, and all the talk about cooperation, there's not much reciprocal investment there, is it? China has not really invested much or transitioned much in terms of machine tools or technology or manufacturing skills over to Russia. Quite the opposite. It seems that some Russian manufacturing operations are starting to relocate into China to prevent them being hit by drones and to evade sanctions. So it does seem that it's a bit of a one-way street. So is this an alliance of convenience for China? And do China and Russia look at each other with this sort of, we'll cooperate on some areas, but there's also deep suspicion on others?
There's definitely deep suspicion between Beijing and Moscow. There was large strides in normalizing the relationship, of course, after the Cold War, already during the Gorbachev era. But there are still areas where there of limits in the no limits friendship. My colleague ICDS Sanshiro Hosaka published a report precisely about limits on intelligence cooperation between the two countries. That's one area that often there's actually, in fact, friction between the two countries. And I think when it comes to the investment and economic side, Russia definitely, without the trade and that's engaged in with China, they wouldn't be able to. The war machine and the economic calculation that they're doing, it wouldn't function the way it's been functioning so far. So in that sense, China is an indispensable partner for Russia. But Russia is not an indispensable partner for China. It is valuable in some sense because of its attempts to be a major power, because of its land size, of course, because of its nuclear arsenal. So there is some value for China, in this very let's say autocratic calculation. I think a wiser perspective would be to actually just stay away from Russia with the current government that they have. But of course, kind of China and Russia, or rather the CCP and Russia, they share a similar outlook when it comes to international order, wanting to legitimate their systems of government in the international stage. I say that as if this was something benign. It's rather to legitimate profoundly corrupt and almost inhuman systems of government that devalue human life. That's why they know that it's illegitimate and that they need that to find that validation in some other way. So that's kind of the core of why they coalesce. And when it comes to the trade and perspectives, this is something that is evolving but definitely essential for Russia nowadays.
Well, we're back to that idea, aren't we? That they are in some ways the sense of victimhood that their systems that they see as valid will never be seen as valid by the West. It will always be seen as, let's say, less than progressive. And they're on some kind of scale in evolution which is below democratic systems. Yes, that it seems that that will never go away, and they will always need to push themselves forward to try and debase our systems and show in whatever way they can that they think they're superior to ours. Well, Ivan, I think that's been absolutely fascinating. I'm delighted to have had you on the channel there and to cover so many issues of the global challenges thrown up by a resurgent Russia. It's been a thrilling conversation, and thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.